Welcome back. Thanks so much for coming back out this evening. Hopefully you had an opportunity to find a local restaurant and get some good food this evening. Nobody gets to go into a food coma though. So we will keep going, and I have no doubt that we've got exciting remarks ahead of you, so I'm not worried whatsoever that that's going to be much of an issue. It is my pleasure this evening to welcome our guest speaker who has joined us from Idaho. As you saw in the biography that was in the information in our registration packets, Congressman Mike Simpson is joining us this evening. As you saw, he is in his 11th term in Congress, having served in the Idaho legislature prior to that, and as you saw, began his career at the city council level. So sort of that traditional or maybe classic trajectory from local to state to the federal level. What you didn't see in that biography is that he, like maybe the best of the politicians, I think, started that political career perhaps a little inadvertently. Joined the race for the city council expecting it to be an uncontested race, and before he realized it was facing 5 other candidates for the seat that was most likely open. And I think, there's this sort of axiom about leadership that the best leaders are the ones who don't want to be leaders. I think in some ways the best politicians are the ones that maybe enter into that somewhat reluctantly or pragmatically, and my sense of the congressman's career is that's very much been the path that he has pursued throughout. As we consider and think about inviting lecturers for these events, we're always looking for folks, of course, that have background and expertise and a unique and important perspective to share on the topic at hand. And certainly that's the case here. As I've had the opportunity to listen to the Congressman talk a little bit about his career this evening, what has become really clear is that he is, I think, unfortunately, an increasingly rare species of politician who is very pragmatic. And as he said earlier, has, I think, as many friends on the other side of the aisle as he does on his own party side of the aisle. And I think given the kinds of challenges that we face in agriculture, that kind of pragmatic but really well-grounded approach is particularly important. And so, having said that, I am looking forward to hearing the Congressman's comments and perspective on agriculture and the challenges that are faced in agriculture. So without further ado, please join me in offering a warm welcome to Congressman Mike Simpson.
Thanks, Eric, for that introduction. It's nice to be here at Montana State University. I'd never driven, actually, on 191 from West Yellowstone up here. It's a beautiful drive. It makes it harder and harder to get on an airplane and go back to Washington every time I do that. I drive around my district and my staff says, no, you have to go back. But I've been there for a number of years, but I got to tell you, in all honesty, it's great to be here. It's great to be in Montana. I really like this. And informed people is the basis of and a necessity for successful democratic government. The people of the United States are entitled to hear all sides of a question. How true that is. I've got a calligraphied quote in my office in D.C. that I had when I was Speaker of the House. And it is by Henry Clay, one of my heroes. Anybody that can run for president 4 times and lose, you got to be a hero. But he said, politics is not about ideological purity or moral self-righteousness. It's about governing. And if you cannot compromise, you cannot govern effectively. When you think about it, this is the most diverse country in the world. If there's a race, a religion, an ethnicity, a political philosophy, an economic philosophy found anywhere in the world, you'll find it represented here in this country. And yet we elect people to run for the city council, the school board, county commission, state legislature, Congress, and we expect them to go to Congress or to their respective bodies that they were elected to and solve problems. That sometimes means, not sometimes, it always means working with people that sometimes disagree with you. And that's how you get things done. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to hear what the Wheeler Center's doing and some of their goals in the future, trying to figure out how does the population decide whether what they are hearing is accurate or not. When you turn on the news at night, how do you know whether that's accurate or not? Especially when you can turn on two different news stations. They'll be talking about the same thing and you wouldn't know it. They're that far apart. And so many people today get their news off the internet. We get calls all the time about strange things and people asking me, well, you know, you get to, as soon as you've served one day in Congress, you get that salary for the rest of your life. And I go, is that true? And they say, yeah, I heard it on the internet. And, you know, they wouldn't let it put it on the internet if it wasn't true. I said, well, if that was true, why would I serve 2 days? And they went, oh, I hadn't thought about that. It's like the guy who called me one day, and an appropriation bill is, and I sit on the Appropriations Committee. I've been chairman of the Interior Committee and chairman of the Energy and Water Committee, and since we lost the majority, I'm now ranking member of the Energy and Water Subcommittee. But I had a guy call me, and he was upset that I had voted for an appropriation bill because there was a provision in it that he didn't like. The biggest compromise in Congress is an appropriation bill. And I said, well, you know, I didn't like that provision either. And what I have to do is look, and if it was a standalone bill, I would have voted against that. But I have to look at a bill and say, in total, is it good or bad? There are things in every bill that I don't like, but there are things that I think are important. If I think overall it's good, I'll vote for it. If it's bad, I'll vote against it. He said, well, let me ask you. He stuck me on this one. He said, if I offered you a cup of coffee and said there's just a little cow manure in it, would you drink it? I said, oh, that's a pretty good question. I said, let me ask you. If I came across you struggling across the Sahara Desert, you were dying of dehydration. And I said, here's a bottle of water. Problem is, there's just a little cow manure in it. Would you drink it? It's circumstances. And he said, yeah, I guess that's true. Most people in the United States are pretty common sense. Even though you hear the crazies on both sides every night on TV, it's pretty common sense. American people have a lot of common sense. We wanted to talk a little bit about agriculture and rural economy, what's happening in the United States, what we're doing in Congress to try to help rural communities survive in a changing environment in both ways, environment, and in changing times. I was going to, and maybe I will, go through some of the things that we're doing. Probably the two most important things we do in Congress in terms of agriculture is pass the Farm Bill, which passed last year, and the agricultural appropriations that we pass every year. This year, on our ag appropriation bill in the House, we expanded access to the broadband services for rural communities, which is essential. If rural communities are going to have access to continuing education, to higher education for people that want to move and run a business out of rural communities, and more of that is happening, we put $660 million to expand those broadband services. We put $6.9 billion for rural electric and telecommunication loans. We put $1.45 billion in grants to subsidize for clean drinking water and waste disposal systems, and that's on top of the billions that the EPA spends on clean water systems, enforcing the Clean Water Act and the Clean Drinking Water Act and the Waste Disposal Act. We put $3.4 billion in agricultural research, which is vital, so that we can develop new crops that are more resistant to disease, that need less water, and other types of things like that. A few years ago, I had a guy run against me in a primary. He criticized me, big commercial, that I had voted for lobster research in Maine. And of course, in Idaho, they're going, what the hell are you doing voting for lobster research in Maine? It took a while to convince the people of Idaho that, you know what? Lobster research in Maine is an awful lot like potato research in Idaho. Then they got it. But the ARS does research on agricultural products all across the country, and we fund it very well. The other thing that we passed, I said, is the Farm Bill. And it is focused on rural communities and trying to enhance rural communities and keep them viable. through a variety of conservation programs, the Conservation Reserve Program. We increased the capped acreage to 27 million acres by 2023. We increased the grassland reserve by 2 million acres. The Environmental Quality Incentive Program, we put more money into it than we ever have in the past. The regional conservation partnerships, the conservation stewardship programs, the agricultural conservation easement program, all of those are important programs for rural communities and for farmers and ranchers to be able to stay in business. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that last year we passed a permanent, and I was at the White House when the president signed this, a permanent reauthorization for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is vitally important to rural communities and to ranchers and farmers that want to stay on their land. Anytime anybody criticizes me on this, I tell them, go down, let me take you down the South Fork. If you've never been down the South Fork of the Snake River, Land and Water Conservation Funds have preserved that to where it is one of the most beautiful rivers, where Dick Cheney used to go fish, and I used to tell him, stay in Wyoming, leave my fish alone. And whenever he was there was black helicopters flying up and down the river. It used to make me mad. But anyway, it is a beautiful place. If it wouldn't have been for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, I will tell you there would be cabins all up and down that river. And the wildlife that's there, you wouldn't be there now. How do I know that? Because I'd own one of those cabins, because it is a beautiful place. But those are the nuts and bolts of the programs that we do in Washington for agriculture. But there are two things that come up that my constituents, and I'm sure the people of Montana, raise every time that we talk about what's going on in Washington and what needs to go on. One of them is immigration reform, getting a legal workforce. And the other one is, I know it's in here somewhere. Oh, trade policy. Trade policy. Let's talk about trade policy first. I was probably more critical, I would say, of the administration on trade policy than anything when they first came in. I've become less critical of them as this has gone along. They've renegotiated NAFTA into the USMCA now. I understand this morning Nancy said that Speaker Pelosi said that she would put it on the floor. It is marginally better than NAFTA was. For some industries, the dairy industry, it is a whole lot better than NAFTA was. And so I think we'll get that done and get it passed. And that's important for trade with our largest partners, Canada and Mexico. What he's been doing with China, I was a proponent of the TPP that they were trying to pass at the end of the Obama administration that when President Trump came in, they walked away from. He likes to do more targeted trade agreements rather than big, broad ones with whole bunches of countries. And he's been negotiating this with China for some time. Now, it's been kind of interesting. Every country that I talk to, any representative from any country, will tell you that China cheats on intellectual property, they steal intellectual property, they manipulate their currency, and on and on and on about the things that they do. Every country says China needs to be taken to task for it. Well, this administration is the first one that sat down and said, we're going to take you to task for it. Now, I'm not really happy with the tariffs. I don't think tariffs are a smart way to do it. But at least he's got their attention. Can they negotiate a deal? I don't know. But every country that is going, that knows that China needed to be taken to task and somebody needed to stand up to them, secretly will tell you, I'm glad you guys are doing that. Now, they won't say that publicly, but they'll say it privately. But China is our biggest challenge right now in terms of trade. There are other trade agreements that have been put into effect with Japan. We've got some problems with one in Australia. From what I understand, you can't sell beef in Australia. That's kind of a problem. What's going to happen with the EU and the trade agreements with them? I don't know, because nobody knows how Brexit's going to finally end up when Boris Johnson gets his way or doesn't get his way or whatever the hell they're going to do over there. But it's going to be a mess. But we're going to have an agreement probably with Europe and also another one with EU. So those trade agreements are vitally important. When you have 5% of the world's population and you produce 25% of the world's wealth, you better have some trade agreements. One out of every 4 rows of potatoes grown in Idaho is for export. You better have some trade agreements. So they're vitally important. Like I say, I was critical of the administration to start with, but I kind of think this is his style, is that he goes out and he beats the crap out of somebody, verbally and everything else, and then backs off and comes to an agreement, which is what he did with the NATO allies and other things about paying their fair share of dues. So we'll see how this works out with trade, but it is vitally important that we get these done. I was happy to hear that Nancy is going to bring up, Speaker Pelosi, is going to bring up USMCA and get that passed. The other issue that my constituents always ask about, daily ask about, is immigration. I will tell you that I was against piecemeal immigration reform for a long time. Because every time you fix one problem, it moves you further away from an overall the pressure goes off doing a comprehensive immigration reform, which is really what we need. I've come to the conclusion we're not going to do comprehensive immigration reform. It's just too hard. So I've been working with a bipartisan group. Zoe Lofgren is the chairwoman of the immigration subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee. She's from California. We have had our staffs meeting. There's about 4 different offices involved. We've had our staffs meeting for the last 8 months, coming up with an ag immigration bill. It's a good bill. We hope to introduce it next week, or when we get back. We had 3 or 4 problems we had to work out. But remember, we're negotiating with Farm Workers Union, and we're negotiating with the growers and the producers, and all of these different organizations who have their own views on things. But they're having to give and take to come up with a compromise that we can hopefully pass Congress. But it will create, if you're in the dairy industry, it will create a program for year-round labor, which they don't have now, and many other things that are vitally important. I can't go through it step by step because it's way above my head. My staff knows about it, but they're all working on it, and hopefully we will have this bill ready to go, and we'll have about 60 co-sponsors. And Speaker Pelosi has said that if it's a bipartisan bill and we got enough co-sponsors, she'll put it on the floor. What'll happen in the Senate, I don't know. But it is vitally important that we solve this problem with immigration. I've said for a number of years, and maybe I'm just being too simplistic about it, but we got 11, 12, 13 million people here that are undocumented. 99% of them, probably higher than that, are just people trying to make a living, trying to improve their lives. I would give them permanent green card status, not citizenship. If they want to become citizens, they go through the regular process. They don't get to jump the line in front of anybody else. But if they have a permanent green card and their mother dies in Honduras or Mexico or wherever they're from, they can go back to the funeral and come back and work. I was several years ago, me and former Speaker of the House in Idaho, who's one of my friends, his wife and my wife, and we were down in Cabo San Lucas. We were staying at this resort that was had a couple bedrooms and a kitchen and all that kind of stuff. Nice place. And we went out, and a guy came by, and he was doing the gardening and trimming up the trees and a few things. So Bruce and I went out and talked to him. What we found out is that if he could save every cent he made, he's married, he's got 2 kids. If he could save every cent he made, nothing was taken out in taxes. If he could take his full paycheck and just put it in the bank and do that for 1 year, he could stay where we were staying for 1 night. Now, if you're this guy, what are you going to do? You're going to try and improve your life. For yourself, your kids, your wife. Sometimes that means You might try to cross the border illegally. Most people that come here just want to improve their lives. We ought to help them do that. We need them. And people say, well, we need to deport them all. Do you know what would happen to our economy if you could identify, first of all, 14 million or 13 or however many it is, people that were here illegally, and you could actually deport them all? Our economy would collapse. Our agricultural economy would collapse. Our dairy industry would go under tomorrow. So we need to solve this problem. And contrary to my previous view that it needed to be comprehensive or nothing at all, you need to, I think we're going to have to do it as piecemeal as we can to get it done. If we can get this ag one done first, then we can get on with the DACA kids. I have a hard time understanding why anybody is opposed to a DACA solution. These are kids that were brought here when they were 2 and 3 and 4 years old, brought across the border by their parents illegally. Many of them didn't know that they were illegal until they went to get a driver's license, and their parents said, by the way, you're not here legally. This is the only country they've ever known. If you're going to deport them, where are you going to send them to? What country are you going to send them to? No country they've ever known before. It makes no sense. We need to solve this DACA problem ASAP. If we could do those two things, then maybe we can move on to the general population of what do you do with the other ones that are here illegally and stuff. If you've committed crimes, you're a criminal, pick them up and get them out of here. But that's not the majority of these people. So hopefully we will get this done this year or early next year. Next year it's going to be hard to do anything because there's nothing of interest going on in Washington. And that might make it actually harder to do anything this year because everything seems to be focused on that. But believe it or not, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And there are issues that are bipartisan that we can work on together. People have asked me, is everything really as partisan in Washington as it seems on TV? Not really. I've got a lot of friends on both sides of the aisle. We sit down and try to solve problems. On the Appropriations Committee, we work together to try to solve problems. I tell people, I could get on the news every night if I wanted to. All I got to do is say something really stupid. And you're going to be on the news. And that's what happens, unfortunately. And so I've kind of given up listening to those things. But there are a couple other programs that are important to agricultural area and rural America. One is the SRS program, Secure Rural Schools program. Everybody know what that is? At one time, counties that had timber sales, a certain percentage of that timber sales went to their schools and their counties for payments. In some districts in Idaho and some counties in Idaho, that was 50% of their budget. Well, of course, when we stopped cutting trees the way we used to cut trees, those numbers went down. So they started what they called a Secure Rural School program where the federal government was going to make up those lost revenues. And it was a 10-year program. And the argument was, okay, in 10 years, we want you to diversify your economy. And I'm kind of going, okay, you're in Chalice, Idaho. Town of maybe 1,500 people, if that big. It's in the middle of nowhere. Beautiful. But, it is a long ways from anywhere. I don't know that you're going to diversify. I don't know that Google's going to land there. And I don't know how you're going to diversify your economy a lot. And consequently, a lot of these rural counties, they can't diversify themselves to make up for those lost revenues. So we've got this program that continues on and on. A couple of years ago, when I was the ranking member on the Interior Subcommittee, the chairman was a guy named Jim Moran, really good guy. He was the former mayor of Alexandria, Virginia. And Jim and I got along great. One day we're in there, we're talking about secure rural schools. And he was just sitting there listening. Finally he said, I wasn't going to say anything, but my constituents want to know why they have to pay for your schools, why they have to pay for their schools, and why we have to pay for your schools too. I said, that's a good question, Jim, a legitimate question. So I brought him up some papers which showed that actually in the West, if you look in Idaho, I'd never looked at the numbers at Montana, but I'm sure they'd probably be similar. We actually pay a higher tax rate than they did in Alexandria, but spend less per pupil than they did in Alexandria. Because so much of our land is public land that's untaxable. And I said, I want you to take this home and look it over. And to Jim's credit, he came back the next day, he said, I looked at that, and I didn't know what I was talking about. People don't understand what it's like to live in a public land state, the pressure that puts on some places. Custer County, I just mentioned a little bit ago, Challis, Idaho, 94% federal land, 2% state land. That means they have 4% of taxable land. It's a county that's about 4 times the size of Rhode Island. And they have 4% of the land that they can tax. They still have roads they have to maintain. They still have police and ambulance service they have to do. They still have search and rescue they have to do. Unfortunately, by the end of January, they've usually used up their search and rescue budget. But there's 4,000 people that live in that county. So what are they going to do without secure rural schools or without PILT payments? So making PILT payments mandatory is vitally important to rural America. And the reason it needs to be made mandatory is because your county commissioners around here and your school boards have putting together their budgets. And they don't know whether PILT payments are going to be there because it takes us so long to pass our appropriation bills. Our fiscal year in Congress starts on October 1st of every year. You know the last time we passed all our appropriation bills on time? 1994. 25 years ago. So we continue to do these CRs, so those counties and those school districts that are going to depend on this don't know what the revenue is going to be, so how do they know what to budget and stuff? That's why we need to make it permanent and mandatory. And we're working on trying to get that done. But I do have some problems with some of the PILT payments. It's one of the things I'm going to be looking at. I like to bring up things that get me in trouble. As an example, it takes not only the federal land in a county, but it also in the formula considers population also. And if you look at it, Idaho last year, in 2019 this year, has 32.6 million acres of federal land. Montana has 27.4, difference of roughly 5 million acres. Idaho gets $32 million in PILT payments. Montana gets $34 million in PILT payments. That's not too bad. That's fairly equal. I can live with that. But when you get down to the state level, Ada County, which is where Boise is, about 20% of the population of Idaho lives in Ada County. They have a total of 297,000 acres of federal land. Custer County, the county I was just talking about, has 10 times as much, 2,935,000 acres of federal land. Ada County gets 823,000. Custer County gets 777,000. And yet they still have these needs in these counties. Ada County really doesn't need, I can say this here because I'm in Montana. Ada County really doesn't need that because they have a huge tax base in the city of Boise and so forth. So I'm going to sit down with some people and start looking at the formula for the PILT payments and how it's determined and how it affects really rural counties as opposed to counties that actually do have a tax base, even though they do have some federal lands in it. And I'm not trying to take away their PILT payments or anything, but I think we do need to relook at the formula. The problem is, and there's always a problem, it's like when I was Speaker of the House. The transportation funding formula, a bunch of counties, one including my home county, came to me, the county commissioners, and said, we need to redo the funding formula for transportation. And they had it all laid out. And of Idaho's 44 counties, they had 32 counties would benefit by redoing this formula. 12 of them wouldn't. So I looked at it and I said, yeah. I said, the problem is the 12 counties that wouldn't benefit are the 12 counties where all the people are. And they elect probably 2/3 of the Idaho legislature. How do you think you're going to get that through the legislature? So you had to wait for a year when you had sufficient revenue that you could hold them harmless as you brought the others up. And it would probably be that same way with the reorganization of the PILT payments. Something that we're not going to try to harm any counties, but we're going to try to bring those really rural counties that need some help and bring them up. That's one of the things I'm going to be working on. One of the other issues that I'll talk about for a minute, and then we'll open it up to some questions because I'd like to hear what you have to say, has really got me in trouble. I shouldn't say that. I gave a speech at the Andrus Center last April. And my question was, and this involves, and the reason I bring it up here is because it involves Western Montana. The BPA, Bonneville Power Administration, is facing some serious financial challenges. I said at one time they were going broke. That was probably an overstatement. But they are facing some serious financial challenges. The administrator told me the other day, well, no, we've made every treasury payment that's ever been due for 35 years. I said, yeah, I know that. But how did you make your last treasury payment? You extend the debt out on your WOOPS debt. So it's like me putting my current bills on my credit card and saying I'm paying down my debt and paying my bills. Well, no, you're not. All you're doing is extending your debt. But they're facing some really financial challenges. And I've got rural co-ops coming to me who support the BPA saying, we ought to be able to buy power on the open market because BPA power is not the lowest cost power in the country anymore. It used to be. It's not anymore. In 1980, we put additional costs on BPA, whether it was for salmon recovery, whether it was for weatherization programs, whether it's the residential exchange rate, all of those types of things that add up to hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars that ratepayers have to pay. And consequently, they're no longer the low-cost producer of energy in the region. So if you're a rural co-op and it's coming time to renew your contracts, your job is to get the cheapest power you can for your customers. Well, if all of them started buying on the open market and not BPA, then BPA goes under. They're going to face that reality unless BPA's costs can get down. The other thing that is a challenge for my district is we send 487,000 acre-feet of water every year out of the state to flush salmon over 4 lower snake dams. That wouldn't bother me if salmon were coming back, but they're not. Every Idaho run, all 8 of them, are either on the endangered or threatened list. If we don't do something to save salmon within the next, this is the iconic species of the Pacific Northwest. If we don't do something to save them within the next decade, they'll be gone. Now, some people think that means I want to remove dams. And I tell them, I hate the idea of removing dams. The thing I hate even more, though, is reading about the salmon runs that once used to be in Idaho that aren't there anymore because we let them go extinct. So I'm willing to look at all options. My goal is to save BPA and make them the low-cost producer of power in the Pacific Northwest again, and get healthy, sustainable salmon runs back in Idaho, whatever that takes. Think about this for a minute. A salmon they spawn in the high waters of Idaho, Marsh Creek, up in Stanley, 6,000 feet in the air. They swim around there for a year, maybe less, about a year or so. And then they get flushed down the river. They don't swim down the river, they get flushed down the river. They're actually their head is facing upstream. So they're not swimming down the river, they're getting flushed down the river. They go through 8 dams, or either barged around them or go through the turbines or whatever. They survive that. They go past the predators on the Columbia. They go out in the ocean. They change from a freshwater fish to a saltwater fish. They swim around out there for about 5 years, growing and becoming really big fish. And then something clicks in their brain. Who knows what it is? But it says, I think I'll go home. And they find the mouth of the Columbia. They get past the fishing nets. They get past the predators. They swim over 8 dams. And they come back to the streams that they were born in. Lay their eggs and die. That's a cycle only God could create. We shouldn't mess with it. So I'm willing to do whatever's necessary. And if that puts me on anybody's hit list, I guess it does. But it's an amazing species. These things swim 900 miles from the mouth of the Columbia, high country of Idaho. They gain 1.25 miles in elevation. These are the Olympians of the salmon runs. So my goal, as I said, is to try to save BPA, because I think BPA is important. Can we do it? I don't know. My other goal is to save salmon. Can we do it? I don't know. And of course, this is all, what we do with BPA is important to Montana, because western Montana, the Libby Dam and the Hungry Horse Dam are, BOR and Army Corps of Engineers dams, and their power is marketed through BPA. And I'm sure you got rural electric co-ops up here that get BPA power. But as we started on this, if you go into my chief of staff's office, it's not an office anymore, it's a war room. And we have, what we're in the process of doing now is asking questions. If you were to take dams out, the 4 lower snake dams, how would you get grain to Pasco? Because right now it's barged, and that's a cheap way to get it there. Loaded at Lewiston, they barge it to Pasco, down to Portland. You'd have to have some alternative that doesn't add cost. So we're looking at alternatives of things that you could do. I'm not sure if you take dams out today, that salmon come back, because there are a number of things that are affecting them. Habitat along the way. The hydropower obviously affects them. The harvest, fishing, the predators, and ocean conditions. All of those things affect trying to recover salmon. You're going to have to address all of them. So this is a big, I probably wouldn't have got into it if I'd have known how extensive this was. But it's going to take some time, but we need to rewrite the Northwest Power Planning Act. Do a Northwest Power Planning Act 2.0 and see what we can do to address some of these issues. We either will do it or it will be done for us. I'm a big believer in that we're better off to take the initiative and do it ourselves, rather than having somebody from somewhere else decide. And while it is true that a federal judge can never order the removal of a dam, only Congress can do it. What a federal judge can do is make it so damned expensive to keep them that you have no other alternative. Last year, a judge ordered a spill of 40,000 acre feet of water down over these dams. It cost $40 million. So a judge can go after it that way. I think we need to get together and bang our heads together and see how we can solve this. Everything we do on the Columbia River can be done differently. Fish only have one option. They have to have a river. And right now we don't have a river. All we have is a series of slackwater pools behind dams that are too warm. It takes a salmon something like 4 times as long as it traditionally did to get from Idaho to the ocean. That's deadly. So anyway, that's one of the minor things I'm working on, along with immigration and some of the other non-important issues and stuff. But obviously, rural America is important. I had a guy come to me the other day. He's writing a book. I know I've got his name in here somewhere. Stephen Strom. I don't know if anybody knows him. He's from Arizona. And he's writing a book about, it has to do with a wilderness area that they've done in Arizona. The Bear's Paws in southern Utah, National Monument. And the Boulder White Clouds Mountains that we did in Idaho. It took me 15 years to get that bill done. And what he's trying, the question that he's asking in his book is, when you do these things, what are you doing for the rural communities around them that are affected by these designations that you're making? It's a good question. And maybe the best one to look at for an example is the Boulder White Clouds that we did in Idaho. As I said, it took 15 years. This area was wilderness study area, which is de facto wilderness. We treat it as wilderness. I decided we need to make some decisions. What's going to be wilderness and what's not going to be wilderness? Everybody says, well, you made 295,000 acres of wilderness. What they don't say is we also released 130,000 acres of wilderness study area for multiple use. Because we made some decisions. But when we started, we had people that wouldn't sit in the same room together. In the end, now they talk to each other. The Idaho Conservation League, cattle ranchers, others get together and talk about issues. And I told Rick Johnson, who was head of the Idaho Conservation League at this time, I said, if we never get this bill done, it's been a benefit in that we have people actually discussing things anymore. And to me, that's what starts the ball moving. And we got this done without a negative vote in the House or a negative vote in the Senate, and Barack Obama signed it in 2015. What did we do for the counties around it? The reason it's kind of a perfect example to study is it involves two counties. One of them is Blaine County, which is Sun Valley. They got more money than they know what to do with. That's where you can't get a house for under $2 million probably, or a condo. I mean, it is, if you've ever been there, Sun Valley is very, very wealthy. Across the border is Custer County. 4,000 people, 94% federal land, 2% state land, and their income ain't quite that high. So what we had to look at is, what can we do for Blaine County? I mean, Blaine County was all, they were all in from day one. Custer County, the first day I met with the county commissioner, one of the county commissioners, it was in a bar in Stanley. And he rolled out his maps and he said, I want to tell you, first thing, I'm opposed to one more acre of wilderness in this state. Now let's talk. And we sat down and we went through his maps. He became one of the biggest supporters of this. Because we did some things for Custer County. Created a community center, helped with our ambulance service, did a recreational trail from Redfish Lake to Stanley. We actually transferred a cemetery that was on federal land to the city of Clayton. When they had a burial, they had to go get a federal permit to do it. That's stupid. So we transferred those things. What did Blaine County need? If you work in Blaine County, you probably live in Twin Falls, 75 miles away, because you can't afford to live in Blaine County. They needed some land to build some affordable housing for their workforce. So we did some land transfers for them. But it took 15 years to get people together and say, what do you really need? Let's get past this idea of I hate wilderness or I love wilderness and say, what do you really need? Because some of these areas need to be protected so that your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren will have the opportunities that you've had. That's why I did that. So it takes compromise, and I guess my message here today is we can solve these. There's no problems we can't solve. But we got to sit down and talk with each other. Even sometimes people you think you might not want to talk to. Because nobody's dumb all the time. People have ideas. and we need to listen to one another. That's unfortunately not what's happening right now in our politics across this country. So anyway, it's truly an honor for me to be here. Mark Johnson has told me all about this, and proud to be a board member. And so I was glad when he asked me to come up and speak, and I didn't know if I'd be able to make it yesterday morning because I spent all Sunday and Monday and Tuesday morning in bed with the flu, but it cleared up just in time. So anyway, thank you all for being here. Let me answer any questions that you might have. Oh, come on, yeah.
Quick question on the Snake River Farmers Association. I think you're probably familiar with them and the H-2A workers that they bring up.
Yeah.
How is the immigration reform going to affect that? Because we in Montana we're members of that association to be exact.
It's going to simplify the whole process. The process is going to be much more simplified. Now, if I got into detail, I'd be wrong on some things because it's a very complicated thing, but it will simplify the overall process. And what I need from you, from all of you, is when we drop a bill, I need your input about how this is going to affect you. Because there's some things in there that if I was king for a day and writing the bill, I probably wouldn't put in there. But we got to work with the other side, and they're important to them, and there's probably some things in there that we put in that they don't particularly like. That's the nature of a compromise, but I need to know how that is going to affect you on the ground and making that work. Because it is it doesn't seem like it should be that damn complicated of a process, but it is right now. And it's like if you put in for 100 workers, you're supposed to be able to the 50% rule. 50% of them ought to be able to have 50% Americans, so you're only going to get approved for 50 of the 100 you've applied for. But if those Americans that take those other 50 jobs come and the next day say, I don't want it, and 25 leave, you got to start the whole process again for the other 25. Well, that's stupid. If you put in for 100, we're going to approve you for 100. You still have to try to get 50% under the 50% rule of them Americans, but if you can't, then you're approved for the full 100. You don't have to go through the whole process again. So just some simplification of things like that. The adverse wage effect that went in last year increased the wages of potato farmers in Idaho by 16%. We've limited that to 3.75%. Some people say that's too high, some people say it's too low, but I'll guarantee you it ain't going down. So we're trying to give some certainty into it that it won't be going up 16% a year and that type of thing. It's overall a pretty good bill, I think. So, but when we get it dropped, like I said, there was two or three or four issues that the members had to work out. Most of this was done with the staff, and they're knowledgeable on all this stuff, And I talk to my staff about it all the time. And there was, I don't know, it's probably 5 or 6 issues that members had to work out. And I think we got those pretty much solved.
Actual fact of the matter is the cost of employing an H-2A worker in Montana now, it went up almost 22+% last year.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can't, I got people in Idaho that can't stay in business with that. Potato farmers. And you all know that if you're a potato farmer, you're actually from Idaho. Because if it's growing anywhere else, it's just a tuber. I try to sell that to my Michigan friends and my when Maine says they grow potatoes, I go, come on. You grow those little blue ones and orange ones and stuff, But anyway, it was Doc Hastings from Washington used to say, they grow more poundage of potatoes than we do. And I said, yeah, but we count quality, and you just can't go out and grow a potato and call it a potato. Anyway, what else? Yeah.
Go ahead if you want.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'd like to add, and while we're on immigration, Association, we on a farm we employ 3 South African workers actually that have been on the H2A program, and they've been with us several years now. One's 4 years and the other one's 3 years, and we've tried. I hope in the new bill there's some gateway to get both. I know the 2 that have been with us for multiple years would love to eventually move here and bring their families here.
Right.
And at the moment, we've tried to get the green cards, and it's a struggle, as you probably will know. And even getting the ones, his wife has tried to come over here. Her visa has been denied probably close to 15 times now, which costs him close to $500 at home.
Yeah.
Which is a good chunk of his paycheck for him back there.
Yeah.
And he's expecting his first child here, so he's trying to get home by November, which is it's all good. But I mean, it would cure a lot if he could just bring his wife over
Yep.
to visit. He's
I agree.
For 9 months. And
I agree.
he can't even get his wife over here to visit and then go back home because the U.S. consulate over there, they just won't let him come, let her come.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid of them not going back home.
Who knows what they're afraid of? Yeah.
Well, that's their excuse anyway. But I hope in the new bill, it's more of a comment than anything, that
Yeah.
there's some leeway to that, at least the green card
Yep,
type
there is.
stuff. I mean, there's a future for them on our place. They've
Yep.
become part of our family now. They are, I mean, great people.
Yep.
Great. They would be a benefit to our community, benefit to everything. And we just cannot get them here. We live in a small community as well.
Yeah.
And we're up in Chester, Montana, and I mean, to introduce 2 or 3 more productive, good citizens into our community is a big deal, that want to grow a family.
Yep.
You know, it's, as you know, in rural communities, 1 or 2 people makes a huge difference.
Oh, yeah.
And we just can't physically or bureaucratically
Yeah.
get them here.
Well, you know, one of the reasons I voted against the last ag bill, the Goodlatte bill that was up last year, is you had to sign up for this, and then you had to do a touchback, which I asked, you know, you had to leave the country for like 45 days. I'm kind of going, why? And they said, so nobody will claim that it's amnesty. I'm like, is that the only reason? But the problem is, who's going to sign up for that program when it didn't do anything from your family that might be here with you that is here undocumented also? You going to sign up for that program and put your wife and kids at risk? And you know that in the touchback, there's going to be some time, at some point, somebody's going to leave the country for their 45 days, and they're not going to be able to get back in. And that's going to go through the immigrant community like wildfire. And that program's dead. So I agree with you. They ought to be able to bring their family here. It is, that's the, and I'm pretty sure that this bill will allow that. But what's going to happen when this is introduced is, on my side of the aisle, on the far right, people are going to say, amnesty. I mean, that's the word, you know. They're going to throw that out as amnesty and all that kind of stuff. On the far left, they're going to say, you didn't make them citizens. And we don't do either one of those things. We do give them a path to citizenship. They have to pay a fine if they've been here for a certain period of time and to get their green card and that kind of stuff. But it's not amnesty. If they want to work towards citizenship, they can do that, but they don't get it automatically. But we're going to get beat up from both sides because of that. Numbers USA is going to beat the crap out of me. Oh, yeah, you just want more cheap labor and stuff. Yeah, not really. Okay.
Switch gears if we could. And you'll be a hero if you can fix this one yet tonight or even my Senate district in the state of Montana here is quite a big portion of the mountain front. We're inundated with grizzly bears, way more than what they ever wanted to begin with. And they're all over in our communities, our schools, our stream beds, our livestock. They're all the way out into the middle of Montana. And
keep them.
And yeah, we cannot, yeah.
Just don't let them go to Idaho.
I think we're going to give them to North Dakota is where they're headed, so in South Dakota. But it just seems like it's almost impossible. I am meeting with Representative Gianforte on Saturday about it, but any intuition on what, is there ever going to be a strategy?
I don't know. I have not been involved extensively in the grizzly bear issue, other than making sure they didn't get listed and that kind of stuff. It was actually Senator Tester and I got the delisting of the wolves done. He worked on the Senate side, but it was Secretary Salazar and I that did it on the House side and put it in the bill that actually became the law that delisted the wolves. And it was kind of like, as you know, that story was you had to have 10 breeding pair in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Montana and Idaho did the right thing. They got together a wolf plan. They had more than enough. Wyoming wouldn't do anything. And so a federal judge said, no, it's got to be all 3 states or none. So we're getting punished because Wyoming won't do anything. And so while we didn't delist them, what we did is went back and reinstated the Fish and Wildlife Service order delisting them and said it can't be overturned by a judge. That really PO'd the judge up here. But once we did that, guess what happened? Wyoming said, why weren't we included? And we said, because you didn't participate. You haven't done anything to put together a wolf plan that's approved by Fish and Wildlife Service or anything else. And I suspect in Montana, just like Idaho, we have wolf season now. Because anybody thought you were going to bring back wolves into a population that had not had wolves here for a number of years, and they were not going to boom in population, and you're not going to have to control that population like you do other species, was living in a fantasy world. And we got quite a few damn wolves in Idaho. In fact, one of the reasons we did the Boulder White Clouds is because the ranchers on the East Fork were so tired of waking up to a lawsuit every day over the salmon runs on the East Fork and losing cattle because of the wolves. And so in the Boulder White Clouds, what we did for the ranchers, it's a totally voluntary program. Totally voluntary. But they can sell their AUMs that were AUMs in what is now the wilderness area. $300 an AUM. Not paid for by taxpayer money, it's paid for by a private foundation. And most of them have chosen to do that because they were tired of all the environmental lawsuits and everything that they got hit with and spending all their time in court and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's voluntary. They can do it if they want to, they don't have to. And some of them have got some pretty good payout on that.
And move the ranch.
What?
They moved the ranches.
Yeah, to other areas. Move their ranches to other areas. Stuff. But that was another thing that we did when we did the Boulder White Clouds, trying to get different groups together and saying, what do you need for this to be successful for you? And that's really what you got to come at. You cannot come in and say, this is what we're going to do. You got to come in and say, what do you need to see in this bill or whatever, this proposal, that can make it successful for you? Then you get people thinking in a different way. When I talk about the Pacific Northwest, Bonneville Power Administration, salmon, all that kind of stuff, people are going to have to buy into this. And what I'm trying to get them to do is, after this speech that I gave at the Andrus Center, that I knew would raise some cackles, more than I thought, I told people that the thing that's going to happen is you're going to go back to your niches, and you're going to say, yeah, there was some interesting points in there and all that kind of stuff. And then you're going to try to protect what you got. It's natural, it's human nature. What I want you to go back and look at is, what do we want this to look like in 20, 30, 40 years? Because that's what we ought to be making the future about. And sometimes that means making some tough choices. So, and that takes a while for people to get onto. But if in the end we can't solve the problems of people and make them whole somehow, it's never going to happen. Yeah.
So I just have a small favor to ask of you.
Okay.
I was excited to hear you talk about the Land Water Conservation Fund. And I was hopeful that next time you see Senator Daines and Tester and maybe Representative Gianforte, you could just put a word in for all that permanently funding the Land Water Conservation Fund has done for Idaho. And maybe give them a nudge about Montana. That'd be really great.
I thought they would be supportive of it. I know that Zinke was very supportive of the Land Water Conservation Fund.
They have committed to fully funding it for this year, but not permanently.
Yeah.
And I know they've made the commitment to do it, but we don't actually have the funding yet.
Yeah.
They're still negotiating out there, and so it'd be great to have funding now and also just not have to worry about it from year to year.
The challenge is if you're going out and making a deal with ranchers or farmers for land and water conservation funding, it's a little hard for a rancher to sign on to something that he doesn't know that the funding's going to be there for. So, I mean, that's a problem. That's why it needs to be mandatory and permanently funded. We've got permanent authorization. We need to have a permanent funding source. What we're trying to find now is find the funding source for it. Actually, you could take, there's $900 million a year that comes from offshore revenue, the offshore drilling revenue. 900 million. It's set aside for Land and Water Conservation Fund. We've never been able to appropriate $900 million. Although the money's there, it goes to the Treasury, so I think the highest we've got is about 450 million. Usually it's around 350 to 400 in that neighborhood. I actually tried to get the county commissioners and the conservation community together. Said, let's take that $900 million, permanently fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and permanently fund PILT payments. Both sides were pretty excited about that. So I got them talking, but I don't know where they are yet on that. But I think PILT payments ought to be permanently funded, and I think Land and Water Conservation Fund ought to be permanently funded. It's finding the source of the revenue. I'll talk to him. I spent most of my time talking to Rob Bishop, trying to convince him that it's not just a land grab.
Thanks. Do you know where that other money's going to?
In the Treasury.
Okay.
If we spent it all, you wouldn't have, it would make the deficit look $500 million higher than it is. That's all it does. There are some things that are really stupid, budget rules that we have to follow that you would think were written on, stones by the Lord, but they're not. They were written by us, and they're stupid, and we can rewrite them, but people follow them if it's to their advantage. One of them is we tax in the energy and water bill. There's a fund called the Inland Waterway, or the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. Army Corps of Engineers get that money, and they dredge harbors, they dredge, the Columbia River, other places. The need out there continues to grow. We can't spend all the money that keeps coming in, so the trust fund keeps growing, even though the need keeps growing, but we can't spend all the money that's I keep saying, if you're going to tax somebody for a purpose and that purpose still exists, then you need to spend that money on that purpose or quit taxing them. But the problem is we have what's called, this is getting into minutia, a 302B, which is the total amount of money we can spend in the energy and water bill. So if I bumped up another $500 million in the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, I'd have to take $500 million out of someplace else in the bill, even though the money's still there. It's just dumb. We've tried to fix it, but our budgeteers that are, budget hawks, so to speak, we haven't been able to get them on board yet, but we're working on it.
I have a question about the cattle markets right now. That aside from some of the trade issues we're seeing just domestically, a lot of producers are not selling this fall, or those who are on formula contracts are losing over $100 a head, while the meat packer profits, I think Tyson and JBS are record profits, over $400 a head that they're making, and it feels like something is wrong with that picture. I feel like it's really affecting a lot of our rural communities, of course, that really depend on that, and I'm just curious what the conversation is that you're hearing or that people are talking about to make sure that there is more opportunity for cattle producers to sell into a fair marketplace?
You know, I wish I could answer that question, but I don't know, but I'll have to look at it and see. Is the Packers and Stockyards Act, you know, is that a factor in all this?
The lack of using it is, yeah.
Is that? It's been 17 years since I was actually on the Ag Committee. But I haven't had my cattlemen,
They haven't told us that.
they haven't come to us and said that, raised that issue with us anyway.
We'll look into Aldi.
Let's take a look at it and see.
So I'm going to step in while we've got a little bit of a pause because you've been on quite a while. So please join me in thanking the Congressman one more time.